Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1. I warn you, we're going to get a little technical in this look. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And in these words, we have this introduction stating some of the key figures. Notice it's Jesus and David and Abraham, and that's the introduction. But then you begin. The actual genealogy goes from verse 2 to verse 16, and it actually sets up where you go from Abraham to David, and then next you go from David to the Babylonian captivity, and then you go from the Babylonian captivity to Jesus. And then verse 17 is a summary statement saying about how there's 14 generations going from Abraham to David. So you have this conclusion and a summary, but it's mentioning this idea of the numbers. Here it is, verse 17. Therefore, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation of Babylon to the time of Christ, 14 generations. So it gets very specific that there's 14 names, and 14 names, and 14 names. And of course, to do that, you counted deportation of Babylon as a name, um, and you counted it twice because there's something going on to try to get that number 14, and it's somewhat of an artificial construct. You see, to get there, we actually omitted some names, where the names of Ahaziah and Athaliah and Jehoash and Amaziah were all omitted. They would notice the genealogy went from Joram to Uzziah, and there were these four names, three kings and one queen, that were in the middle of that were not mentioned by name. Now, the reason for that is because there's a little numbers game going on. You see, in Hebrew, back then, you would sometimes use letters for numbers. When you were a kid, you probably did this as a game. A was number one and B was number two. And for us, it was a game. Back then, they would do that as shorthand because they did not have the Arabic way of writing the numbers, like we write on the right-hand column where we put just a line and that's one, and then a little squiggle and then a straight line at the bottom, that's two. They didn't have that. So what they could do instead, Aleph could stand as one, and Beit as two, and Gimel as three, and all throughout the Hebrew alphabet. It gets a little bit more involved once you get past 10, and then it starts doubling up and things like that, just like the way we write the numbers. And it just so happens if you take the name David and look at the letters, notice I have the Daleth there as 4, and the Vav down there is 6. You take the name David, Dawood, and it just happens to add up to 14. And so remember, so there's 14 generations and 14 generations and 14 generations, and it's sort of playing a little numbers game to picture Jesus as the son of David, and even the name David has 14, the number 14 sort of built into it. Now, that's all background. What we're looking at next is chapter 6, halfway through chapter 6, chapter 1, verse 6. And to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. It's sort of interesting that she's not named. There's a number of other women like Tamar and like Rahab and Mary, obviously, and Ruth that are mentioned by name. But notice, her who was the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, is not mentioned by name. Actually, one of my students did his entire master's thesis on that verse and why she's not mentioned by name. But that's another topic. I'm not going to go into that right now. It was a great paper. So if you're a student at South Florida Bible, go look that up. It's in our library. But notice, it's Asa that I want to focus on for a second, and then there's going to be another name in a minute. And the reason I'm focusing on this name is that when we read the Byzantine texts, and it's not just in the Byzantine texts, but especially in those, and remember in textual criticism, we noted how that there's the Byzantine and the Latin and the Alexandrian, and also sort of a Proto-Alexandrian. But in the Byzantine, and some of the others as well, you read Asa in the Greek text, just like you would expect to read. But if you compare that with a few of the older texts, and I'm thinking especially of the Sinaiticus, and I'm thinking especially of the, let me think, well, let me not say because then I'll probably get it wrong. But definitely the Sinaiticus has Asaph instead of Asa. Now, Asaph was the name of someone, remember the choir director in the Psalms. And of course, the question is Asaph just an extended way of writing Asa? You know, so sometimes you say John instead of Jonathan, or you say, well, sometimes we change it. We say, instead of Robert, you might say Rob or even Bob. You know, sometimes names get shortened. Is this a case of that? The Masoretic text of 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 9 through 11, when we first read about Asa in the Old Testament, the Hebrew, notice it's Asa. I'm not going to transliterate. You should know your Greek and Hebrew by now. And so it says Asa, but notice in some of those older texts, it changes it from Asa to Asaph, so that this is reflected. Now, the Byzantine texts are reflected in a lot of those later texts, but also in the Septuagint. And if you look at your King James Version and your New American Standard, and most translations have rendered it Asa in English, which is the Greek equivalent of Asa. Although there is the Revised Standard Version, and I haven't checked the new Revised Standard Version. I suspect it's the same thing. But the Revised Standard Version, since they were trying to follow some of the older texts of when it came to the Greek in the New Testament, they rendered this Asaph. They actually changed it because it was reflected in the manuscripts they were using. Not only that, we go down a few verses more. Notice unto Asa was born Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat Joram, and to Joram Uzziah, and to Uzziah was born Jotham, and Jotham Ahaz. We continue. By the way, those omitted names. Between Joram and Uzziah, we don't read of Ahaziah, Athaliah, Jehoash, and Amaziah. So that's where those omitted names are. And then we get to verse 10, and to Hezekiah was born Manasseh, and to Manasseh, and here it is, Ammon, and to Ammon, Josiah. Now, Ammon, again, we're going to have a textual variation where the Byzantine texts read Ammon, which is same way of saying Ammon. That's not a difference. It's still the same basic way of reading it. But the older texts instead read Amos. Instead of Ammon, it's Amos, or we would say Amos, which is the name of one of the minor prophets. Now, here again, when you look at the first reference to this in 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 18 and 19, the first mention Ammon, his name is Ammon. There's no difference in the Hebrew text. But again, we have the Septuagint, the King James, New American Standard, and most English translations render that Ammon or Ammon, however you want to pronounce it. But the older text, and again, it's the Revised Standard Version that captures this, go with Amos. Notice you have the Byzantine family versus some of those, and it's not all of them, but just some of those older texts. And this brings up the question, what's the best explanation? I'm not asking what's the correct reading yet, but what's the best explanation of the differences between these? Now, if we go along with, if we say the Byzantine family is correct, then we would have to conclude that those older texts somehow made an either deliberate or, I'm assuming, an inadvertent error. I don't think they deliberately were trying to change the text. I don't think they were trying to be mean and not follow the Bible. They were doing what they thought was right, but it was an error, if this is true, and that this error was then passed on to a few other texts, and so it sort of exemplified. And then, but the later texts, like the Septuagint and like other texts, remain faithful to the original reading. That they didn't copy that error, and so they either corrected the text, and we do actually find in some manuscripts where it reads one way, but then a scribe comes along afterwards and puts in the margin, no, that's a mistake, you need to correct that. So that perhaps corrected the text. Now, there are some scholars that, and if I recall, I think Metzger was one of them, And I think of Tim Mackey, the fellow who did the Bible Project. Great source, by the way. If you've never seen it, go look at the Bible Project. But he suggests that the older texts have the correct reading. And his explanation of that is that he says, look, Matthew. It's not that the kings were really had those other names, but Matthew is playfully changing the names to one of the writers of the Psalms and one of the prophets, and you get the hint that he's doing that by looking at how he stylized the genealogy and left out names. And he's not trying to be exact. He's doing sort of a funky little, he's sort of joking with us in sort of a way to tell us that he's going to be writing about Jesus and about how Jesus is seen not just in the kings, that his ancestry goes back to the kings, but also that he's seen in the Psalms and the prophets. And so that's his explanation, that this reading was deliberate, and the later texts tried to correct this reading, say, no, we've been reading our Old Testament, and that can't be right. And so they actually went back to fix the text. And of course, so in that, he would think that the Revised Standard Version actually has it right, and most other translations have it wrong. One closing thing, the same variants, interestingly enough, are found in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 14 of the Septuagint, but specifically in the Codex Alexandrinus, not in a whole bunch of other texts. And it's interesting, Codex Alexandrinus is not one that has that strange reading in Matthew, but it does have that strange reading in its Septuagint version of 1 Chronicles 3:14, as well as in several manuscripts of 2 Kings 21. And now these are all passages that talk about those kings, where in those cases I don't think anybody's trying to be playful. I think they just made a mistake. They just made an error. Of course, another alternative, sometimes when you're going from one language to another, names change. When you're going from Greek to Hebrew, when you think about this, we say Jesus instead of Jesus or Yeshua. So Yeshua in Hebrew, Jesus in Greek, and Jesus in English. So they don't sound a lot alike, but it's the same name. But as you move from one language to another, there can be inadvertent changes. So maybe it started off as one of those. Maybe there was a textual error. How did it come about? Well, I'll leave it up to you. I don't want to answer the question for you. What do you think?